I told my wife, Sarah, that my conference had wrapped up a day earlier than planned, but I couldn't change my flight, so I'd still be arriving home on Tuesday night. She was supposed to pick me up from the airport around 6 p.m. I could sense some frustration in her voice about me being away for another night, but she said she was excited to see me. After giving it some thought, I realized I had been spending a lot of time away from home lately. I decided I needed to make more of an effort with Sarah, my wife of 17 years, so I headed to the airport to see if I could change my flight. Initially, I almost gave up, but then I noticed there was a flight going to an airport not far from our town. Normally, I use the airport an hour north of US, but this other airport was almost 2 hours south. I had never flown into it before. I checked the flights, and there happened to be one departing in just 30 minutes. I rushed to the counter and was surprised at how easy it was to change my ticket. Within an hour, I was in the air, and about 3 hours later, I landed. I rented a car and estimated I'd be home by around midnight. I couldn't wait to see Sarah's reaction to my surprise early return. It was just before midnight when I pulled into our driveway. The house was completely dark, and Sarah's car wasn't there. That struck me as strange. I brought my bag inside and started unpacking, my mind racing with questions. Where could she possibly be at this hour? I decided not to jump to conclusions, so I called her cell phone. She answered after a few rings. I casually asked how she was doing, and she told me that it was late and she had already gone to bed. She assured me she'd be there to pick me up from the airport at 6 a.m. like we had planned. That really puzzled me. She said she was in bed, yet she clearly wasn't home. I asked where she was, mentioning that I tried calling the house phone and got the answering machine. She said she was in bed at home and blamed the house phone on some technical problem. Apparently, a repairman was scheduled to come by the next day. My head was spinning. Could she actually be lying to me? It just didn't make sense. I then told her I wouldn't be on the 6 a.m. flight and instead might stay a few more days. I promised to call her with the exact details later. She sounded relieved, telling me she missed me and wished I'd come home soon. As we said goodbye, I thought I heard a faint hint of amusement in her voice. After hanging up, I called our home phone again. It rang as normal. A part of me wanted to pick it up and pretend to have a conversation with myself, but I just didn't have the energy for games. Instead, I went upstairs to our bedroom and searched around. Under the bed, in the closet, just to be sure. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I thought to myself, looks like the show's over, folks. I may not be a genius, but years in sales taught me to trust my gut, and my instincts were screaming at me that something was wrong. Early the next morning, I decided to park the rental car on the street across from our house, where it wouldn't be easily noticed. Just after 7 a.m., I saw Sarah's car pulling up. A man was driving. I quickly ducked into the small closet near the foyer, leaving the door slightly open so I could see what was going on. Sarah unlocked the front door, and they both came inside. She told the guy she needed to change and get ready for work, mentioning that she grabbed some clothes for the next day so she wouldn't need to come back in the morning. He chuckled and said he'd help her pack, but only if they could do it one more time. She playfully warned him that he'd make her late for work, and he just laughed, saying that it would be worth it. She called him Paul. He seemed like her boss, and from their conversation, I gathered he had only been working at her company for a few weeks. He made some arrogant remark about how his wife thought Sarah was the perfect assistant and how funny that was, considering their relationship. Sarah laughed it off, and I just stood there, my blood boiling. He joked that if his wife ever saw Sarah, he might end up divorced. Something about Sarah being way younger and much more attractive. Sarah went upstairs, and Paul waited for her, casually looking around like he owned the place. When she came back down, she looked incredible. Hair done, wearing a fitted dress, and they embraced. He kissed her deeply, and I clenched my fists, tempted to burst out and confront them right then. Instead, I stayed put. Paul suggested they spend the night together soon, maybe have dinner and visit some lodge he'd been telling her about. Sarah agreed, giggling as she teased. What if my husband comes home early? Paul reassured her, saying that he'd make sure I called him before I returned, so there wouldn't be any surprises. They joked about me, calling me predictable, saying that even if I did come home unexpectedly, I'd probably apologize for interrupting and offer him a beer. It hurt more than anything. Paul even commented that his wife was away in Chicago, so he felt free to do whatever he wanted for the next few days. I couldn't listen anymore. When they finally left, I stepped out of the closet, my face hot with anger. Not only was my wife cheating, but she seemed to genuinely despise me. I sat down, feeling numb, trying to think things through. Slowly, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I remembered Sarah had mentioned that her new boss, Paul, had recently been transferred from the company headquarters in Chicago. I needed to find out more about him, so I made a few phone calls. After a few discreet questions to the receptionist at Sarah's office, I had everything I needed. His full name was Paul Richards, and he was married with 2 teenage daughters. His wife was planning to stay in Chicago until the girls finished the school year before they joined him in Clearwater. Paul was looking for a house after work each night, preparing for the family to move. I looked up the last name Richards in Chicago using an online directory and found 3 possible numbers for a Paul Richards. The first call paid off. A woman answered, and I politely asked if she was Mrs. Paul Richards. She said she was and asked who was calling. I made up a quick story, pretending to be Mike Thompson from Paul's company, Arcotech. I mentioned that I was organizing a surprise get-together for her husband and that she and Paul would receive round-trip tickets to Clearwater as a treat. She seemed genuinely pleased and asked when it was happening. I told her it would be the following night, giving her some details on the flight, and assured her that the company would take care of all expenses. I asked her to keep it a surprise from Paul, and she eagerly agreed. Next, I started contacting Sarah's friends and family to invite them to a surprise party in honor of her promotion. I told them that her boss had recognized her hard work and given her a well-deserved promotion, so I thought it was worth celebrating. Everyone was happy for her and promised to keep the surprise. I asked them to arrive at our house by 7 p.m. to make sure Sarah would be there. To make sure everything went smoothly, I reached out to a local catering company and ordered food and drinks. I specified that the setup should be done on the deck next to the living room by our pool, a special touch since Sarah had always wanted to host a party there. I explained that the house might be empty when they arrived, but that they could access the deck by going around the side of the house. The next day, I arrived at the airport half an hour before the flight from Chicago was set to land. As passengers headed toward baggage claim, I approached a few women, discreetly asking if they were Mrs. Richards. When I finally heard someone respond to me, I turned to see a woman who looked like she had stepped off a movie set. She introduced herself as Mrs. Richards and asked if I was her ride. I was momentarily speechless, but quickly introduced myself as Mark. I explained that my wife worked for her husband and that I was there to pick her up. She seemed a little wary, so I added, jokingly, that my friends often teased me about having married someone older and wiser, but that it only meant my wife was more experienced and had a bit more to love. Mrs. Richards smiled, and I could tell she was warming up to me. We grabbed her luggage and headed to my car. As we drove up to my house around 6:30 p.m., I explained that the party was outdoors to celebrate both her husband's arrival and my wife's recent birthday. By the time we got there, the caterers were done setting up, and I was honestly surprised at how elegant everything looked. It seemed like a party that had been planned for weeks, not just thrown together in a day. By 7:30 p.m., everyone I had invited had arrived. I asked the guests to park at a church parking lot down the street so that the driveway would be empty. I explained that when Sarah and Paul arrived, I would signal them by turning off the patio lights, and everyone would need to be very quiet. The sliding glass doors leading to the deck had vertical blinds, with cords that controlled them. I also had heavy curtains that we used in winter, which were thick enough to hide behind. A few minutes before 8 p.m., I saw Sarah's car pulling up to the front of the house. I quickly turned off the patio lights and hid behind the curtains. I could hear Sarah and Paul enter, laughing as they did. Paul made a light comment about how nice it was to have some alone time, mentioning how rare it was for them to get moments like these. I watched as he helped Sarah slip out of her dress, revealing that she wore nothing but a skimpy piece of lingerie beneath. They both seemed thrilled, lost in their excitement. Sarah teased him about always being in a playful mood, and he responded by playfully pushing her down onto my favorite armchair. I watched, feeling my anger build, as they began making out. Carefully, I reached for the switch and turned on the patio light. The sudden light stunned them. Sarah froze, her eyes going wide as she demanded an explanation for what I was doing there. Her question seemed ridiculous, given the circumstances. I stayed calm and reminded her that this was my house. It was my name on the mortgage, after all. She stammered something about being surprised by my early return, and I simply nodded. Paul, looking visibly uncomfortable, muttered something about needing to leave and having things to take care of. I casually offered him a drink, which made both Sarah and Paul blink in confusion. I could see the gears turning in Paul's mind, probably thinking about Sarah's earlier comment that I'd just offer him a beer if I found them together. The look on both of their faces was almost worth all the planning. I couldn't help but let a small smile cross my face as I watched Paul process the situation in stunned silence. Before he could say anything, the patio door swung open and Mrs. Richards, the glamorous woman I had picked up from the airport, came marching in, clutching a large purse. She swung it around wildly, hitting Paul in the chest and sending him stumbling several feet back, completely caught off guard. The chaos only escalated as Sarah's mom and her sister appeared behind Mrs. Richards, both with shocked expressions. Sarah, still undressed, was now receiving a fiery scolding from her mother, who couldn't resist adding a sarcastic comment about how Sarah might consider a career in adult entertainment given her latest performance. Sarah was too stunned to react, her face flushed with embarrassment. Then I turned on the porch light, and Sarah finally noticed the 20 or so people who were standing there, all staring at her in disbelief. I stepped outside for a moment, grabbing a plate of potato salad and some chicken wings. I also pulled a can of beer from the fridge before I returned to my seat, where I had a front-row view of Paul trying awkwardly to compose himself, while Sarah tried to cover herself with whatever she could find. Watching this unfold, I found myself almost detached. It was all their doing, their mess. They had put themselves and everyone else in this awkward situation. Maybe it was cruel, but it felt necessary for everyone to see the truth, to rip off the Band-Aid and just move forward. After some time, the chaos settled a bit. Sarah's cousin helped Mrs. Richards gather her things and offered to take her to a motel, while another cousin assisted Paul, walking him out to his car and offering him a ride to the same motel. Sarah's mom turned to her daughter and asked if she wanted to come along, but Sarah declined, shaking her head in silence. Her mother sighed, acknowledging how upset I must have been. She told Sarah she deserved a scolding, but added that it seemed Sarah was already suffering enough. And with that, they left. Sarah retreated to the bathroom, and soon I heard the water running. I stayed seated, enjoying my beer and wings, savoring them more than I ever had before. I couldn't help but feel that, just once in my life, everything had fallen perfectly into place, like a plan that had actually worked. When I finished my meal, I started cleaning up after the partygoers. It took quite a while to put away all the leftovers into the fridge and freezer, and by the time I finally sat back down at the kitchen table, it was well past midnight. I cracked open the last beer of the night and leaned back, feeling the tension slowly leave my body. It wasn't long before Sarah emerged from the hallway. She looked drained, emotionally and physically, as she took a seat across from me. I decided to break the silence first, asking her if she was happy, if this was what she really wanted. I wanted to know what had led her to this point, what had made her think this was the way to go. She hesitated, then mentioned how people always assumed I was a pushover. She wondered aloud if she had done anything to make them think that, or if it had been something in me all along. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. She even brought up the time I got caught with my boss, an old incident that had nothing to do with this, and mused if people thought all women were like that, promiscuous. Then she turned her frustration back on me, saying that I should have come to her if we had any problems. Instead, she pointed out, I had thrown a party and embarrassed her in front of everyone. I just smiled, and I asked her calmly, "Did we have a problem?" Sarah continued, her voice breaking a little as she tried to explain. She claimed she'd never meant to hurt me, that she never imagined I'd find out about her and Paul. She said I'd hurt her intentionally tonight, that I had wanted to humiliate her. I couldn't believe her nerve. I pointed out that organizing a surprise party for my loving wife couldn't possibly be worse than cheating on me, which was exactly what she had done. I told her that I doubted anyone else would see her side of things either. And then, at last, she said what I had expected. Sarah reasoned that none of this would have happened if I had been around more often. She said I hadn't paid enough attention to her, that she'd felt lonely, and that's what made her vulnerable to Paul's advances. I couldn't help but laugh, a real hearty laugh that filled the room. She was actually trying to make this my fault, to get me to apologize for her betrayal. She looked ridiculous to me, desperate and grasping at straws. Eventually, I got up, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door behind me. A deep sense of satisfaction settled over me as I did. It was as if the chains that had bound me for years had finally snapped. I was free, emotionally unburdened, and soon to be legally unbound. For the first time in a long while, I was genuinely looking forward to my future. All right, now that was quite a story, but let's move on to something fresh. So here I am, not at work as I should be, but surprisingly relaxed, sitting at the kitchen table, enjoying a freshly brewed cup of coffee. I really needed this to settle my nerves. There's something deeply soothing about this ritual. I used to do it often when the kids were younger. I'd wake up an hour before anyone else, just to enjoy the peace and quiet. It became a sort of hobby of mine. I'm Ben Crawford, to be precise. I've been married for 25 years, or at least I thought I was happily married, until a couple of hours ago. We have 4 kids, and our youngest moved out just last year. My wife seemed to struggle a lot with the empty nest feeling, so I encouraged her to find a new hobby. Well, I guess she found one. About an hour ago, I realized that hobby had a name. Though I didn't catch it clearly, she just called him Stallion. There she was, urging him on, saying, "Come on, Stallion. Don't hold back. I know you can do it." It was funny, in a dark way, that the smell of my favorite coffee brewing hadn't distracted them. Usually, whenever I made coffee, my wife, Sarah, would be down the stairs in a heartbeat, even before it was ready. But today, she was otherwise occupied. I heard her egging him on, telling him to prove how much better he was than her pathetic husband. His response? "Oh, you're so much better." The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. Almost. I thought about engaging the safety on my weapon. It seemed like a good idea, considering her boyfriend was a cop. How did I know that? Because when I got home earlier than expected, his uniform and duty belt were spread out across my living room floor, right alongside all of Sarah's clothes. Their voices carried through the house, echoing off the walls with phrases like, "Harder, baby," just like that. And I've never felt this way until you. Thank God you came into my life. The steady creaking of the bed and the rhythmic thumping of the headboard against the wall made it almost impossible for me to focus on what I needed to do. I wasn't sure how much time I had, but based on how long they had already been at it, and given their enthusiasm in what used to be my bedroom, a place I had no intention of entering again, I figured I had enough time to gather my thoughts. It was clear this wasn't their first time together, especially when I heard Sarah mention wanting more of it. We've got to find a way to do this 2 or 3 times a week instead of just once in a while. It cut deep to hear those words coming from my wife, or at least, the woman I thought was my wife. How did I end up in the middle of this nightmare? Simple. I went to work and realized I'd forgotten my briefcase. No, actually, I had left it in the garage because I'd put it there while rescuing the cat from under the car hood and then forgot all about it. Whiskers is our second cat. One winter morning years ago, I forgot to check under the hood, and that was the end of Mittens, our first. There's no sound quite like the one a cat makes when it gets caught in a fan belt spinning at 1,000 RPMs, fur everywhere. It's a mistake that haunts you. I guess Mittens wasn't clever enough, and neither am I, apparently. Their words kept echoing in my ears. "You'll never let that useless husband of yours touch you again, will you?" "No, never again. I swear." My briefcase wasn't really that important, but I had a client meeting, and I needed it. So, I turned my car around, drove back home, and the first thing I noticed was a patrol car parked right in front of the house. My heart sank instantly, like I'd been stabbed. I thought something horrible had happened to Sarah. I pulled into the driveway, almost hitting her new silver Lexus. The plaster garden gnome wasn't so lucky. It shattered as I skidded into the drive. I didn't even bother closing the car door. I just ran inside. And that's how I ended up here, drinking coffee in my own kitchen, trying to stay calm. Take me now, stud. Make me feel amazing. God, it's never been this good. The words were jarring, to say the least, and I wished more than anything for a glass of whiskey, but I needed to keep my head clear. Their passionate cries from upstairs were bad enough, but the real pain was the things Sarah said. "You're so much better than Ben," she moaned. "Give me everything, baby." Apparently, this got him even more fired up, because the whole house felt like it was shaking with their activity, and his cursing grew louder. I never thought I'd be the type of guy to hear his wife in the throes of passion with someone else, especially not in our own bed, and definitely not in the way she was going on. Riding him in some twisted, cowboy-style position, breathlessly telling him how much it turned her on. That's when I lost it. I rushed to the bathroom, leaned over the toilet, and threw up everything I'd eaten for breakfast. I was surprised they didn't hear me or notice the smell. Maybe they were just too engrossed in their fun. A part of me still couldn't believe what was happening, even with all the evidence right in front of me. I mean, Sarah is 50 years old, and this guy couldn't have been more than 30. He was built like an athlete, while Sarah, well, she wasn't a match for him, not physically at least. I'm no fitness model, but still, why chase after a married woman? The whole thing seemed to go on forever, but after about 90 minutes, the noise stopped. I assumed they were taking a break. Then I heard Sarah say, "What's that smell?" There was no response from her cop lover, just a lot of commotion as I heard them fumbling around, opening closet doors, rummaging through dresser drawers, and even shuffling through the laundry basket. I figured they were trying to cover up any evidence of their little romp. In that moment, I made a mental note. I definitely need to get tested for STDs. Suddenly, they both saw me at the same time. Sarah gasped, her face going pale. Her lover, too, seemed stunned. He glanced over at his uniform, and his face twisted into something like despair. He started to move toward it, but Sarah stopped him with, "It's not there, stud." He froze, looking confused. "What's not there?" "Your gun," she said, her voice cracking. "That guy, he took it when he left." The realization seemed to hit him like a brick. He looked ready to vanish into thin air as his face fell. He dropped to his knees, desperately digging through the pile of clothes on the floor, and then I heard him say something that almost made me laugh out loud. "He took my throwing knife too. It's gone." He sounded completely defeated. What seemed to crush him most, though, was when Sarah added, "He mentioned the serial number was scratched off. That's like 5 to 7 years in prison right there." Former Officer Paul Richards looked shattered by the news. "He's a very thoughtful guy," I said, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "We had a nice little chat while you two lovebirds were busy upstairs." Sarah quickly looked out the window toward the street, realizing what I'd said was true. "Yeah, he took the patrol car too. He mentioned something about you providing security at the construction site and said he might as well take the car. He was going to take your uniform too, but he figured you might need it when you left here." Paul looked like he was about to collapse, and Sarah just stared at me, her eyes wide and terrified. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. I let out a deep breath, savoring the moment. "You could call your wife for a ride home," I said, turning back to Paul. "But probably not. She's not too happy about that video." I sent the video to her. It was hard to hear her response at first, but it had something to do with her father, who apparently was the chief of police. "How could you do this to your kids?" she yelled. It seemed that Sarah had already told him about their children. I found myself almost enjoying this moment, like reeling in a fish that was just barely hooked, taking my time. I glanced over at Paul, and then back at Sarah. "I'd offer you a ride," I said, "but Sarah's car has been impounded." "What?" she shrieked. "My car." "Yeah, Sarah. The police impounded it," I said, shaking my head with a sigh. Turns out there were a couple of ounces of unaccounted-for marijuana in the front seat. Sergeant Daniels said they usually just write a ticket if they do anything at all, but, well, they felt they owed me a little something for all the trouble the department put me through. "Don't worry. You should be able to pick it up in a few days after they finish their investigation." She wasn't shouting anymore. Her voice had turned into a kind of low, miserable moan, almost like a lonely dog howling at the moon. "Well, officer," I said, turning to Paul, "it's time for you to put your uniform on and get out of here." So, he did. After Paul left, Sarah finally seemed to snap out of her stupor enough to speak. "Please, Ben, I love you," she said, her voice desperate. "It didn't mean anything. It was just a stupid fling." Oh, man. I wish you'd told me that earlier, I said, smiling a bit too easily. I was worried you actually loved him and were planning to leave me. Now I feel kind of bad. Maybe I overreacted, huh? I shook my head. You know I love you, Ben. I've always loved you. Why would you doubt that? Well, besides the whole cheating on me thing, there were some other clues, like making love to another man in our bed and calling me a spineless idiot. Just for starters, I said dryly. Oh, honey, that was just talk. It didn't mean anything, she stammered. We were just trying to, get in the mood. Then she paused, suddenly narrowing her eyes. Wait, you said you overreacted. What did you do? Her voice had taken on an edge, her gaze sharpening as she studied my expression. Ah, well, I said, leaning back slightly. Just when I thought you didn't love me anymore, I decided to send the video to the kids. I wanted them to see who their new daddy was going to be. You might want to hold off on calling them, though. They seemed pretty upset for some reason. I thought they'd be happy for you. Well, guess not. Sarah's face turned pale. You didn't, she cried, her eyes wide with horror. I just nodded. Oh, and one more thing. You probably already know this, but your lover's wife, Mrs. Richards, works for the same company as you do. She's the executive assistant to the CEO, if I recall correctly. Don't worry, though. I asked her not to fire you. You're still going to need that job, especially if they transfer you to their Little Rock office after all this. Sarah stared at me in shock, tears welling up in her eyes. Why are you being so cruel, Ben? Well, Sarah, I didn't mean to be cruel. I just thought everyone should know who you really are, including your friends on Facebook, I said, shrugging. And judging by the comments, they seem to be pretty happy for you. At this point, Sarah seemed to collapse in on herself. She sank to the floor, still wrapped in a bedsheet, tears streaming down her face as she muttered, This can't be happening. This can't be happening to me. I sighed, glancing at the clock. All right, Sarah, it's time to get dressed and pack a bag. Your parents should be here soon to pick you up. Pick me up, she said, looking up at me, her face streaked with tears. Well, of course. You need a place to stay, don't you? This house will be sold as part of the divorce proceedings, I said casually, as if I were discussing the weather. Divorce? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked genuinely stunned, as if she hadn't considered that this might happen. You really want a divorce? Sarah, I'm surprised you even need to ask, I replied. What did you think would happen when I found out about all of this? She didn't answer, just stared at me, her eyes full of disbelief. The room fell silent, except for the occasional hiccuping sobs she couldn't seem to hold back. A few minutes later, I heard her parents' car pull up in front of the house. She glanced toward the window, then slowly stood up, dressed but without her suitcase. Ben, honey, are we really? She started to say, but her voice cracked. I cut her off before she could finish. Yes, Sarah, it's over. Her parents knocked on the door, and I went to open it. Farewell, Sarah, I said, holding the door open for her with a courteous gesture. She walked past me, her head hanging low, and her parents helped her out to their car. All right, that was a story full of surprises, but let's keep the momentum going. That evening, after everything was said and done, the house was eerily quiet. I couldn't find my wife, Alice, or our kids anywhere. My name is Mike Lewis, and my wife Alice and I had been married for 11 years. It wasn't until I noticed the silence that I saw the note on the kitchen table. Mike, I'm sorry I can't tell you this in person, but I'm too much of a coward to face you. I've met someone else and I've fallen in love. The kids are with me, and they are safe. The divorce papers are in the envelope under this note. As you'll see, I'm not asking for anything. Alice, in just a moment, my day and my life spiraled completely out of control. I was pacing back and forth across the kitchen, cursing under my breath as I went through the divorce papers and eventually slumped into a chair. Alice was leaving me everything. Our home, the savings, all the money. She was taking only her clothes, the kids' clothes, and their toys. But the last demand in the papers was what really set me off. Alice wanted me to sign adoption papers to allow her new partner to adopt our children. It felt like she had already decided everything. At least now I knew who she had left me for, Henry Larkin. I decided to call my soon-to-be ex-wife. When she picked up, I greeted her with a short, "Hey, Alice." She replied with a quiet, "Hi, Mike." I couldn't help but ask, "What the hell is going on?" Alice sighed and said she had met someone else and fallen in love, like she'd mentioned in the note she left me. I scoffed, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Oh, sure, of course, Alice. No one just leaves their family and shacks up with some guy. You didn't do it in our bed, did you?" She sighed and asked me to keep it civil. After that, I hung up, took a shower, and changed into fresh clothes. I wasn't in the mood to cook, so I headed out for dinner. The food was decent, but after everything that had happened, I decided I was owed more than just dinner. I headed to a bar nearby to have a couple of drinks and try to drown out the day's chaos. The man Alice left me for was Henry Larkin, the owner of Larkin Construction Company. I had done a few projects for his company in the past, but that was definitely about to change. While I was at the bar, my buddy Rick spotted me and came over. He seemed surprised to see me out. "Wow, Mike, out on a weeknight? Did you manage to escape the family for a bit?" he asked, smiling. I laughed half-heartedly and said, "Yeah, something like that." I explained that I'd come home to an empty house and divorce papers on the kitchen table. Rick looked stunned. "Alice is divorcing you?" he asked, clearly shocked. I never saw that coming. I nodded and said I was just as blindsided. I mentioned that she had moved in with Henry Larkin, and Rick's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean Henry Larkin from Larkin Construction?" I confirmed it was the same guy and added that Alice claimed she was in love with him. Rick asked me what I planned to do. I told him I'd sign the divorce papers. She didn't want anything from me, and I wasn't going to beg her to stay. I added, but there was one form I refused to sign. She wanted me to let him adopt the kids. "That's not happening." Rick shook his head, disgusted. "Man, Larkin's a piece of work," he said. I nodded and told him I was supposed to start a new project for Larkin's company on Monday, but that I was going to find another gig instead. In the end, I signed the divorce papers, despite Alice's attempts to make me reconsider. She eventually stopped trying, and when the divorce was finalized, our daughter, Chloe, was 10, and our son, Lucas, was 8. I wanted to make Larkin pay for what he'd done, but I wasn't about to do anything that would land me in jail. I simply never showed up for the job on Monday, and strangely enough, no one ever followed up with me. Part of my revenge came without me lifting a finger. Word about what happened spread, thanks to my conversation with Rick, and most of the local contractors refused to work with Larkin Construction after that. They saw what he did to me and decided they didn't want to do business with him. Sure, Henry eventually found other contractors, but they were subpar, and the quality of his projects dropped significantly. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, 3 months later, Alice and Henry got married. During their honeymoon, I took care of Chloe and Lucas for the week. I didn't do it for them. I did it for the extra time I got with my kids. It was better than just having them on the weekends. But what bothered me was Chloe's question one night. "Daddy, why did you send us to live with Mom and Henry?" "What? I didn't send you anywhere, sweetheart," I said, shocked. "Your mom took you because she doesn't love me anymore. If it were up to me, you'd still be here." I tried my best to explain that it wasn't my choice, and I planned to confront Alice about it. When Alice came to pick up the kids, she looked suntanned and relaxed, like nothing had happened. I wasted no time. I told her to stop lying to the kids and to tell them the truth. I warned her that if she didn't, I would. "The kids know I didn't ask for this. If you don't set things straight, I'll fight for custody," I said. Alice just walked away, visibly frustrated. Life as a single guy was strange after being married for so long. Some friends tried to set me up on dates, but I wasn't in the mood for that. I wanted love, sure, but I had no desire to go through the whole dating circus again. I didn't know it at the time, but my life was about to take an unexpected turn. My neighbors were Emily and Jack, who had moved in shortly after Alice left. Their place had been a great deal, but it needed a lot of fixing up. Emily worked as a secretary, and Jack was a retired Army veteran. We got along well, they were friendly, and we often had short, pleasant conversations when we ran into each other. Everything seemed fine until tragedy struck. Jack had a sudden health crisis at work one day. Paramedics and a doctor arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Jack was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy later revealed that he had died from a subdural hematoma. Emily was left alone, devastated and overwhelmed by the sudden loss. I offered Emily my condolences and, since her parents were away on vacation, I walked her back to her house and poured us both some drinks. She was still in shock, crying as she talked about what she might do in the future. Eventually, she cried herself to sleep on my couch. I covered her with a blanket and stayed in the armchair, wanting to be there in case she woke up during the night. The next morning, as Emily was leaving, Alice was pulling into the driveway to drop off Chloe and Lucas. "Good to see you're not wasting any time, Mike," Alice said snidely, giving me a cold look. "Come on, Alice, give it a rest. Emily just lost her husband." I snapped back. Alice glared at me for a moment before turning her attention to the kids. Later that day, I explained to Chloe and Lucas why Emily was leaving the house. Chloe seemed sad about it, while Lucas didn't seem to fully grasp the situation. A few days later, Emily invited me to attend Jack's funeral, which I did. Thankfully, in the UK, most mortgages are insured, so Emily wouldn't be left in financial ruin. But it was still a small comfort given the weight of her loss. After her parents returned from Europe, they spoke to me at the funeral, and I promised them I would look out for Emily, since I was pretty much her only close friend besides her colleagues. I also offered to help her with minor repairs and household tasks to keep her place in decent shape. The next time Alice came to pick up the kids, she stayed in her car, which was honestly fine by me. I had no desire to talk to her. Over time, Emily and I started spending more time together, but it wasn't in a romantic sense. We were just two people helping each other get through rough times. One day, about a year later, I heard Lucas chatting with Emily out in the garden. I called out to him, telling him not to bother her, but Emily reassured me that it was fine as she hung laundry on the clothesline. It made me think that maybe Emily would like to join us for dinner. I suggested it, and Lucas immediately got excited, wanting her to come over. Emily agreed, and we all shared a good laugh about it. Emily helped prepare dinner that night, and it was obvious she knew her way around the kitchen. After we ate, she assisted with cleaning up and then sat with us for a while before heading home. As she was leaving, Chloe looked at me with a smile and asked, "Is Emily your girlfriend, Dad?" I chuckled and shook my head, telling her Emily was just a friend and our neighbor, though secretly, I wouldn't have minded if she were more than that. On a Sunday afternoon when Alice came by to pick up the kids, I knew they would tell her about Emily joining us for dinner. And, as expected, the next time Alice came to get them, she had a particular interest in Emily. I told her that Emily was just a friend and reminded her that what I did was none of her business. Alice then mentioned she didn't get everything she wanted out of our separation. I shot back, "You left for your dream life with Henry. He can have his own kids if he wants. You aren't taking mine." I let my voice harden as I added, "He took you away, wrecked our marriage, and now he wants to take my kids? Not happening." Alice pouted but walked away, clearly annoyed. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her leave. About a year later, I hadn't seen much of Emily for a while, partly because I had been very busy. My friend Rick was rewiring a house for a young couple, and he asked me if I could handle a complete plumbing rework. I put in a bid, and it was accepted, so I spent a few weeks deep in work. While I was working with Rick, he kept me updated on Larkin. Apparently, Henry was still having trouble finding local workers, and he had to rely on non-local contractors, which meant the quality of his projects kept taking hits. When I finally finished the project, I found myself with some free time for the first time in a while. I decided to ask Emily out to dinner. She agreed, and we planned it for a Saturday night. When I went to pick her up, she took my breath away. Emily was petite, with her hair cut in a cute pixie style. She wore a dress that flattered her slim figure, and for the first time, I realized how much I was attracted to her. Dinner went well, and we talked for hours, sharing our lives with each other. When we got back to her house, I walked her to her door, and as she turned to thank me for the evening, she surprised me by leaning in and giving me a passionate kiss that left me breathless. Afterward, she smiled and suggested we go out again to see where things might lead. She kissed me on the cheek, then went inside. We did go out again, and the second date ended with us spending the night together. Despite her small stature, Emily was incredibly passionate, and it was a night that left me feeling happy in a way I hadn't in years. Over time, Emily and I grew closer. She eventually decided to sell her house and move in with me. Chloe and Lucas were thrilled to see me in a relationship again, and I knew they'd tell Alice about it. Predictably, Alice wasn't thrilled, but while she didn't want me, Emily did, and that was all that mattered. A year after our first real date, Emily and I got married. When the kids told Alice, she just gave a dismissive snort and looked away. Emily and I eventually had 2 children together, Gary and Robert. By then, my older kids were old enough to visit on their own, which meant I didn't need to see Alice much anymore. Years went by, and one day Chloe announced her engagement. Her boyfriend, Josh, had proposed the night before, and she was overjoyed. As her father, I offered to help with the wedding expenses. Chloe explained that they had initially thought they wouldn't need any financial help, but Henry had offered to cover the costs on one condition. He wanted to walk her down the aisle. Chloe refused, and when she did, Henry withdrew his offer, leaving her upset and worried about the costs. I was livid at Larkin for trying to use money to manipulate my daughter, and Emily, ever the practical one, suggested we use the funds from the sale of her old house to cover the wedding expenses. I hesitated, considering it was Emily's money, but she insisted, encouraging me to let Chloe know that we would cover all the wedding expenses. When I told Chloe, she was ecstatic, and we put together a budget that allowed them to have everything they wanted while keeping things reasonable. The next day, Chloe mentioned that Henry was furious about our offer and that Alice wasn't happy either. One afternoon, Lucas showed up unannounced in our garden, clearly frustrated. He said he wanted to leave home because he was tired of hearing his mother and Henry arguing constantly. Emily asked if they were still fighting about the wedding, but Lucas said it was something else entirely. He then mentioned overhearing them during their private moments and hinted that Henry wasn't exactly doing a stellar job in bed. We couldn't help but laugh, and honestly, it felt pretty satisfying to hear. The man who Alice thought was her ticket to happiness couldn't seem to deliver when it counted. Lucas decided to stay with us for the night to avoid the tension at home. On Chloe and Josh's wedding day, it was obvious that Alice was still upset. Chloe had told her that she and Henry could sit behind Emily and me during the ceremony, and though Alice tried to hide it, it was clear she wasn't pleased with the arrangement. The church service went off without a hitch. At the reception, I agreed to let Alice sit at the head table with us, something that was important to Chloe, but Henry was placed with Emily, Robert, Gary, and Lucas instead. After all the speeches were done, the caterers moved some tables to clear a space for the dance floor. Chloe and Josh led the first dance, and soon after, Emily and I joined them. Even Alice and Henry joined in eventually. Later that night, I found myself at the bar, where Gary and Robert were sitting with one of Chloe's bridesmaids and her children. Lucas asked Emily if she wanted to dance, and I encouraged him to go for it. As soon as they left, Alice came up to me. She was clearly tipsy, and I could sense this conversation was not going to go well. Alice began by commenting on how young Emily still looked, adding how surprising it was that she hadn't aged despite being the mother of 2 boys. Her words were laced with sarcasm. Then she moved on to criticize Emily's appearance, her weight, her outfit, anything she could think of to be spiteful. I simply looked at her and said, "Alice, we're divorced. You don't get to have an opinion about my life anymore." But she just kept at it, making jabs at Emily. I defended my wife, telling Alice that Emily was far more of a woman than she could ever hope to be. I even hinted at how satisfying my intimate life was with Emily, leaving Alice stunned and speechless. At that moment, Henry came over, looking uncomfortable as he sensed the tension. I turned to Alice and said, "You know, when you left me, you thought you were trading up. Maybe you were, or maybe you weren't, but honestly, I don't care. I've moved on. I have my own life now, a loving wife and 4 wonderful kids." With that, I walked away, leaving her standing there, her face a mix of shock and anger. I returned to Emily, and we danced slowly. As we swayed to the music, she looked up at me, her eyes full of curiosity, and asked, "What was all that about at the bar?" I just smiled and told her to kiss me, promising I'd explain later. We shared a deep kiss, and I knew Alice was watching. When we broke the kiss, I glanced over at Alice, who quickly turned away to order another drink. I looked back at Emily, smiling at her, and I couldn't help but think to myself, I really had traded up for something far better, someone who truly loved me, someone who made me feel whole again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely at peace with everything that had happened. Emily was everything I could have hoped for, and I wouldn't trade what I had now for anything in the world.